Hi, everybody. Thank you for rushing, sort of. So the next talk is, I think, going to be quite fascinating for you as well. We're very lucky to have David Ludwig here. He is from the US, but currently in Copenhagen, and he'll be talking about the carbohydrate-insulin model of obesity. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, John. These are my disclosures, mainly books for the public. Can I get this screen on the bottom here? On the left, yeah, if possible. So about 150 years ago, a group of German physicists proposed the first law of thermodynamics, which says that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Very familiar. Applied to body weight gives us the much stated equation, calorie intake minus calorie expenditure equals calories stored. And since humans and other mammals store most of our energy in fat tissue, we can change the right side of the equation to body fat. Now, this law of physics has been evoked to explain pathophysiology, in other words, cause and effect, regarding obesity. The Endocrine Society in the United States, in a much-cited review, said that obesity pathogenesis involves sustained positive energy balance, intake greater than expenditure. And a panel of expert organizations throughout the world said basically the same thing. To achieve weight loss, an energy deficit is required, and they considered that high evidence strength. But I'd like to begin today by saying that equating a positive energy balance with increased fat storage is meaningless. It's a tautology. It tells us what we already know. It's like considering fever a problem with heat balance. Too much heat into the body, not enough heat out of the body. Now, of course, that's true, but it's so obvious we don't have to instruct patients when they visit us in clinic in the physics of heat. And we don't have to begin every textbook on fever with restatement of this physics principle. For a more informative translation of physics to biology, we have to replace the equal sign with causal arrows. In other words, does the positive energy balance cause increased body fat storage? Or conversely, does increased body fat storage cause the positive energy balance? Neither violates the law of physics. They're still related, but they have profoundly different implications for understanding the cause and treatment of obesity. The conventional view, which has acquired the name the energy balance model, considers the arrows of causality flowing from left to right. In our modern food environment, it's easy to overconsume these energy-dense, tasty foods, according to this way of thinking. And it's hard to burn off those excess calories because we live sedentary lifestyles. Calorie-rich, energy-rich substances like glucose, free fatty acids, and of course ketones build up in the bloodstream, and they're forced into fat cells, making them anabolic, making them grow, and we gain weight, develop obesity. Now, a fundamental precept of this energy balance view is that all calories are alike to the body. That Endocrine Society statement said the impact of diet and obesity risk is explained largely by its effects on calorie intake, rather than by changes of either energy expenditure or the internal metabolic environment. Stated differently, a calorie is a calorie. And we've heard that before. And if all calories are alike to the body, then the only way to lose weight is to eat fewer of them or burn more off with physical activity. Eat less, move more. We've heard that one before too. This notion has guided obesity treatment for more than a century, beginning with arguably the first modern weight loss diet. This woman, Lulu Hunt Peters, was the Atkins of her day. This was a wild bestseller, and the idea was pretty simple. You just divide all foods into 100-calorie portions. You figure out how many of these units you need. You cut back by 3 or 4 or 500, and your weight problem in time will be solved. From the early 1900s, we could call that energy balance 1.0, to the late 1900s, the first food guide pyramid was an iteration of this. Fat, the most energy-dense nutrient, was placed at the top specifically because it had so many calories, whereas a variety of carbohydrates, including processed carbohydrates, should be the basis of our diet. To what could be called the energy balance model 3.0, with its new focus on modern processed foods, specifically ubiquitous, cheap, convenient, energy-dense, ultra-processed foods, high in portion size, fat and sugar, low in protein and fiber. Now, this is a more complicated iteration of this concept, but you can still see the basic principles as echoing over the last 100 years. And these are considered to act not just on our conscious minds, but also subconsciously on food reward and sensory processing and appetite. But there are 4 anomalies, things that can't be readily explained regarding this dominant paradigm. And the first is the simple failure to control the obesity epidemic. We've been calorie counting, cutting back on fat, watching energy balance for a century, and obesity rates keep going up. Now, at some point, it's common to blame the food industry for manipulating the public, and ultimately the public for not adequately following our advice. But at some point, when do we ask, maybe it's not the public's fault, maybe there's something the matter with the advice? Secondly, how do we explain rising BMI among genetically stable populations? In the 1960s, the average man weighed about 75 kilos. Today, that man in the United States has the same genetic risk for obesity, but he weighs 90 kilos. If you tried to reduce that man's weight to what the prevailing value in the 60s was, his body would fight back, not only with increasing hunger, but with slowing metabolism. So his body is fighting back, and he's unhappy with that level of body weight. So why is the same weight that the average man maintained in the 1960s so difficult to maintain, not just for psychological reasons, but for biological reasons? Third, the development of obesity involves just a very small increment in calorie balance on a daily basis. 1 gram of excess fat storage. That's less than the calories in 1 teaspoon of sugar. Considering how much people don't want to have obesity and how much we focused on it, why is it so difficult for the population in general to control their energy balance? It's just eating a little bit less, even if this operates through subconscious mechanisms, because we know that adults can control their behavior over many subconscious temptations, drugs, sex, all sorts of behaviors. We use our conscious mind to manage. Why is it so difficult to manage these small, incremental differences over time? And the last anomaly strikes to the heart of the notion of overeating to begin with. Since 2000, rates of obesity are continuing to go up quite dramatically. And for that to happen, one would think that, according to this paradigm, we have to be eating more than 19 in 2000 for 2 reasons. It takes extra calories to cause the weight gain, and then it takes extra calories to maintain those heavier bodies that burn off more energy moving around. If anything, the opposite's happening. Based on 2 measures of dietary assessment, energy intake, if anything, is declining since the year 2000. And a new study by one of the chief proponents of the energy balance model actually has a bit of a knife going right to the heart of the model itself. According to this meta-analysis, the time we're spending in physical activity and the energy we're burning off is increasing, and yet our metabolic rate, our resting energy expenditure, is declining. So we're eating less, and we're moving more, and getting fatter. We need an explanation for this paradox. One explanation is this is wrong, and we're thinking about obesity from the wrong end of the telescope. We shouldn't be looking at the left-hand side of this equation, which is behavior. We should instead be looking at the right side. And according to the carbohydrate-insulin model and a broader paradigm that considers, I think Ben Bickman used the word endocrine, model of obesity, or metabolic model of obesity. The problem begins at the fat cell with a substrate partitioning defect. Something is causing fat cells to take in and hold on to too many calories. So there are too few, not too many calories, at least at key time points in the postprandial period. We'll come back to that. The brain perceives this as an energy crisis and responds as it's supposed to. So there isn't a problem in the brain that's driving overeating. The brain is doing what it's supposed to. It's regulating metabolic fuels that are needed for moment-to-moment survival because not enough of them are staying in the bloodstream as long as needed to fuel our metabolism. So that's why we get hungry. That's why we eat more. And if we're one of those few people that can actually control our hunger and avoid overeating through tremendous self-discipline, the body fights back in other ways by slowing energy expenditure. This way, the positive energy balance still happens, but it's a symptom, it's a consequence, it's a downstream event. And what could be causing fat cells to hoard too many calories? Well, that's endocrinology 101, insulin. You've heard about that from Ben Bigman. Insulin is the dominant hormone that regulates the storage and metabolism of all of the major metabolic fuels. And I won't go through this in detail. And what could be causing increased insulin secretion? Well, that's nutrition 101. All of the carbohydrates, and especially the processed carbohydrates that flooded our diet, especially during the low-fat years, when we were focusing on reducing energy density, and sugars and starches were considered at least innocuous, if not actually helpful, to dilute fat energy. And that's the terms that were used as little as a quarter of a century ago. David Unwin probably remembers, right? You can dilute your fat energy with sugar and starch. So in addition to the amount of carbohydrate, it's the type of carbohydrate as characterized by the glycemic index, which reflects how rapidly those carbs are going to digest, turn into sugar, and how high insulin will rise as a consequence. And the concept that takes these both together is the glycemic load. So let's have a look at a few experiments to see what might happen mechanistically. So in this study, we looked at 12 adolescents with obesity in our hospital's metabolic ward in a crossover feeding study on 3 separate days. And we gave them 3 different meals with the same calories for that individual. One was instant oatmeal with a little milk and sugar, so highly processed, fast digesting. A second meal matched for macronutrients was steel-cut oats, or Irish oatmeal. This is an old-fashioned method. The kernel remains largely intact. It takes a half hour to cook. It takes longer to digest, and it has a more subtle effect on blood sugar. And a third meal that we included to maximize the contrast was a vegetable omelet with fruit, no starch or added sugar at all. And this had a little more protein and fat and a little less carbohydrate. We followed blood tests and hunger in the morning. Then we gave the same meal you're seeing here at lunch and followed voluntary food intake. So this is the only real technical slide here. On the left, insulin after the meal rose as expected, substantially higher after the instant oatmeal in yellow than after the steel-cut oats in red or the vegetable omelet in blue. But glucagon, and that's come up a few times in the conference, is sort of like the yin to insulin's yang. They do opposite things, and they are designed to have an exquisite tango-like dance in the postprandial period to precisely control the flow of metabolic fuels consistent with the meal eaten. And in most situations, that works well. The problem is when you eat a meal with too much processed carbohydrate, it stresses the system. Glucagon is suppressed after a high glycemic load meal. So we have too much storage signal, anabolic signal, not enough catabolic signal. So that's going to be a double whammy, and we can see that in terms of the metabolic fuels. Blood sugar after the initial surge comes down into a relatively hypoglycemic range, 3, 4, 5 hours, the late postprandial period. And at that time, free fatty acids, a key metabolic fuel, were also suppressed. Many short-term studies, feeding studies, look just at what happens in the first hour or two. You give a kid or an adult a low-fat meal, a bagel, low-fat cream cheese, and orange juice for breakfast. For the first hour, she's going to be feeling fine. That's not the time to look. The time to look is what happens later in the morning, when you're either ravenously hungry and eat the extra snack, or you're feeling satiated and continue to go about your business without thinking about food. Is this important to the body? Epinephrine, which you've also heard about, is an emergency stress hormone secreted when the brain thinks the body's running out of fuel, or it's a fight or flight. But hypoglycemia is arguably the reason we have these counter-regulatory hormones. Epinephrine remained perfectly stable for 5 hours after the low and medium meals, but surged after the high glycemic index meals. Same calories, different metabolic states. And when we gave subjects free access to food after a second meal, they ate hundreds of calories more after the high glycemic meal. Now, this is just an acute study, so we need longer-term studies. But if a fraction of this effect were persistent, it could explain much of the energy balance change that we've seen associated with the obesity epidemic. So to begin to look in a chronic model, we went back to the laboratory with rats who we gave identical diets, identical macronutrients, changing only the nature of the starch. So fast digesting amylopectin starch, or slow digesting amylose starch. That's a tighter molecule. It's fully digestible in these animals, except it just does so more slowly. And we further pair-fed them to keep their weight the same through the 18 weeks of the study. And on the left, you can see that body weight between these two groups, high and low GI, was effectively indistinguishable. But to do that, to accomplish that, we had to put the high glycemic index animals on a low-calorie diet. They were beginning to gain more weight on the same food, so we had to restrict food intake to prevent that weight gain. What is that saying about metabolism? It's slowing down. So despite the fact that we were able to control the weight, the high glycemic index animals still had 70% more body fat at the same weight. And since they weighed the same, they had less lean tissue. I'm going to show you one graphic slide. I'm glad that this isn't after lunch. These two animals have the same genetic risk for obesity. If you didn't know that, you'd say the one on the right, is an animal model of obesity with genes that are promoting the problem. The one on the left actually ate more. The one on the right had much more fat and was a metabolic mess. I'm going to argue that this is, to use the Latin term, this is a prima facie case for a disorder in substrate partitioning. There's no way you can get this from the energy balance model. In the energy balance model, you cut calories to prevent fat storage. How do you get the combination of less energy intake, less lean mass, but more fat mass? And this is not I don't have time to go through this today, but this is not an unusual situation. In most animal models of obesity, including leptin deficiency, you can control food intake, or sometimes even feed the animals less, and they still have more adiposity. People focus on the food intake, and they call these hormones like satiety hormones. But all of these hormones in the brain that seem to relate to food intake also affect metabolism, and you can see that in these pair-feeding studies. So while we focus on the food intake because that's a dramatic difference, that doesn't tell us what the origin is. There's always going to be a positive energy balance, but a classic principle in medicine and science is to go to the source of the problem to treat it most effectively. Okay, do we see any evidence of this in humans? I'm going to thank the BMJ for their willingness to publish this study back in 2018. The Framingham State Food Study, one of the largest macronutrient feeding studies ever done of this question. 164 young adults with high body weight were first put on a run-in low-calorie diet to lose 10% of their weight. So that's going to put their metabolism under stress. And then we randomly assigned them at that lower body weight to low carb, moderate carb, or high carb diets for 20 weeks. Now, we fed them all of their meals during this time. This was over 100,000 meals. Gary Taubes of NUSI will remember this because they were the main funders of the study. And we further adjusted weight for the people, like we did with the animals, to keep the weight the same at that post-weight loss anchor. And the diets were 60-40, 20% fat, 20-40, 60%. I'm sorry, 60-40, 20% carb, the complementary pattern for fat, and protein was kept at 20%. In a sub-study, we saw that same pattern of metabolic fuels. After eating the high-carb meal, there's plenty of calories in the blood, too many calories in the blood for the first hour or so, but then too few, a dip-off in the late postprandial phase. And here's the primary endpoint, according to either the intention to treat analysis or the per protocol analysis. Per protocol are the most of the people in the study, 120 of them, that we were able to keep within 2 kilos of their anchor weight. And for some people, we were unable to do that. Presumably, they had more noncompliance. So we could perhaps look at the right side, the per protocol, for the most accurate estimate, but we get the same thing either way. Looking at energy expenditure by doubly labeled water, which also gives the same result as just looking at the calories it took to maintain their weight. So we've looked at this in multiple ways that suggests validity of these models. Energy expenditure dropped a little bit on the high carb diet, stayed about the same on the moderate carb diet, and increased on the low carb diet, a difference of 200 to 250 calories a day, which, if real and persistent, would be really important from the standpoint of body weight control. But perhaps more importantly, it's indicating that the body is functioning better in the sense that it's not holding on to calories. It's allowing free use of energy because it feels less deprived on a low-carb diet. And that's going to translate into a better internal state, of course, for weight loss. And Ben Bickman showed a slide in which we think we saw one source of the difference, not the whole difference, but fat cells, the white adipose tissue, were a little more metabolically active on that low-carb diet. So then we come to the ultimate question, do we see this in the long-term human studies? Contrary to what was said during the low-fat diet years, low-fat diets are inferior to all higher fat comparisons in multiple meta-analyses. It's the opposite of what was thought would occur according to the energy balance model 2.0. These differences are not large. They're 1 to 2 kilograms, but they're opposite what was thought. More importantly, these are overwhelmingly low-intensity interventions where people, the studies are oftentimes under-supported, $100,000 or $200,000 compared to 1,000 times that for a drug study. Low-intensity interventions where people are simply told, eat this or that, given some recipes and meal plans, and then they have to do it themselves. And we know that differentiation is poor. There are very few studies that do a better job. This study done in Israel was able to control one meal. It was done at a work site where they were able to feed people at the work site different diets. There was, of course, at home for breakfast and dinner. There could have been lack of differentiation. But on this direct study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, a low-carb diet that was eaten ad libitum, as much as you want, did better at first than a Mediterranean moderately high-fat diet, and then they sort of caught up. But both of those higher fat diets did better, significantly better than the low-fat diet over 2 years. And a study by RNA strips group, Diogenes, basically came up with the same finding using a different design. Weight loss first to achieve 8% weight loss on a run-in diet, and then people were randomly assigned to lower high protein, lower high glycemic index. So the low glycemic low diet is the one on the bottom, showed perfect weight loss maintenance over the next 6 months. You rarely see that in a weight loss study. The high glycemic low diet showed the most weight regain And the two medium groups showed intermediate values, which is about the closest thing you'll see in a diet study to a drug study like dose response curve. Let's take a moment on drugs. That's been the elephant in the living room. Diabetes drugs that increase insulin action, either insulin itself or things like thiolysinediones, which increase action in fat cells, cause weight gain, perfectly well established. Most drugs that decrease insulin action, even though they're controlling blood sugar, cause weight loss. What about GLP-1 receptor agonists? In a paper promoting the energy balance model and criticizing the carbohydrate-insulin model, the author said, despite acutely raising insulin secretion, GLP-1 receptor agonists are currently the most effective approved medication to treat obesity. So do their effects disprove the carbohydrate-insulin model? Well, GLP-1 is an incretin. It's actually of the two incretins, it's the least potent one in secreting insulin from beta cells, but this hormone and the drugs based on them do cause insulin secretion to the beta cell. But they also have a major effect slowing gastric emptying. Another study from RNA strips group, GLP-1 versus saline, looking at the rate that Tylenol, paracetamol, gets out of the stomach and into circulation. And you can see that there was a marked decrease in the rate of gastric emptying with this drug. It slows down gastric emptying, and therefore, what's going to happen to insulin? Look at that dramatic difference. Insulin isn't higher after GLP-1. It's much lower with the first dosage and persistently. There's some tachyphylaxis, but there is a persistent effect on gastric emptying, especially the first phase, which is the key one that relates to insulin secretion. This is after 12 weeks. We can still see slower gastric emptying, lower insulin. And we're beginning to get case reports of this in anesthesia. Before surgery, people fast, sometimes for 24 hours, and the surgical literature is filling up now with case reports of food remaining in the stomach of people on these GLP-1 agonists. So, in fact, the actions don't contradict the carbohydrate-insulin model, even though these agonists certainly operate in the brain directly through other mechanisms related. The actions support the carbohydrate-insulin model and look a lot like a low-carb diet, slowing gastric emptying, delaying nutrient absorption, lowering insulin, lowering ghrelin, raising adiponectin, and improving measures of insulin sensitivity. So that raises the possibility of a study. What if we could combine a low-carb diet with GLP-1 agonists, not one or the other, but both, allowing us to decrease the dose used, so then it's going to cost less and we'll have more drug for the rest of the world, decreasing potential side effects and unknown risks, and providing a diet that will allow for transition off the drug, since nobody wants to be on a drug for a lifetime. Okay, so I've argued that the carbohydrate-insulin model says we reverse cause and effect. Overeating isn't the cause, it's the consequence of gaining fat. And this has been driven primarily by dietary carbohydrates through insulin secretion. And you have to have a name for a model. But that doesn't mean the model is exclusively focused on carbohydrate and insulin. It's an intellectual infrastructure for understanding how many factors in the diet, sleep came up, Ben, I agree, stress, physical activity, and also endocrine disruptors came up, is a model for understanding how all of these things could affect body weight regulation, not by making us hungry and passive automatons that can't control our behavior because we're just unable to say no to temptation, but through biological effects. And here's the full model. It was published in AJCN. We paid the egregious open access fee, so please download it, make my investment in that fee worthwhile, and have a look at the model. We'll go on record, and we say in this that this is wrong. George Bach said all scientific models are wrong. Some are useful. So this is This is how we currently envision it, but it will have to change over time. Now, I'd like to take I have a few minutes left, and I'd like to have a comment on looking forward. So we need much better research. As I mentioned, to produce obesity by middle age requires the storage of just 1 gram of excess fat, 10 calories a day. You're never going to see that in a very short-term feeding study. So we need metabolic feeding studies with creative designs, maybe kids who are sent away to institutions for education, where you can really well control, or even prisons if we had ethical protections against some of the egregious problems of the past. So we need better feeding studies. We need behavioral studies that are long enough with good intensity, and we need cohort studies that ideally extend through childhood into adulthood. And it's important to get the science right. The low-fat diet of the 1990s arguably hurt things by giving these foods the green light. And now we have this new notion of ultra-processed foods. Now, I want to go on record as saying I think the notion of ultra-processing is good. And I think that we will want to talk about its implications to the future. But it may be imprecise. This third time I'm going to cite Arne Astrup here. He participated in a debate in AJCN on the notion of ultra-processing, and I'm just citing his side of the argument, not Carlos Montero's, which was the other side, and Carlos was one of the originators of the notion. But Arne points out that there's not all things that are healthy by NOVA are actually healthy by common sense, and vice versa. So NOVA ultra-processing characterization says white rice, bread products purchased with refined wheat or flour, fruit juice, burger made in the home. I'm sorry. These things are healthy by NOVA and clearly unhealthy. Whereas things like the pumice olive oils, it's not the extra virgin, but a later pressing of the olive oil. It's going to look very much like extra virgin, minus a few good antioxidants and such. Non-calorically sweetened yogurt, a burger made with whole grain bread in the home would be unhealthy. So we need to distinguish this, and I'd like to propose the carbohydrate-insulin model offers a roadmap for moving forward here. The processing of carbohydrates is a big problem. I've made that the focus of my talk today. Wheat berries are much different than white bread. Steel-cut oats, instant oatmeal, whole fruits versus fruit juice. When you process carbohydrates, you make the starch or the sugar immediately available to the digestive tract, and in the small intestines, they get broken down and absorbed in seconds. But that's not the case with fats or proteins. Fats or proteins are inherently slow digesting due to their molecular structure. Is olive oil much less healthful than olives? I don't think so. How about peanut butter versus peanuts, guacamole versus avocado? Is a steak much different, a hamburger much different than a steak, other than the price you'll pay at the restaurant? Tofu versus, in fact, tofu may be advantageous over soybeans. If we're going to have moved to plant-based options for proteins, we're going to need highly processed forms of protein. Scrambled eggs versus boiled eggs. So I'll leave it at that. So let me conclude now by saying that the ideas I present today may be provocative, but they're not new. I'd like to cite this quote. One of the causes of hyperinsulinemia and hypoglycemia is the excess ingestion of glucose-forming foods, and that, as a result of the overactivity induced by overeating, the islets of Langerhans become exhausted, and diabetes follows. It is possible that the hunger incident to hyperinsulinemia may be a cause of overeating and therefore the obesity that so often precedes diabetes. So this is what I said today. This was Seal Harris 99 years ago. Thank you for your attention.
David, thank you very much for that. It's the second time I've heard you share that information. And one of the shocking things for me is some of the studies that you showed us, particularly your studies, were published more than 20 years ago. We've known about this for so long.
I don't give up easily, do I?
No. But why is it so slow?
Like the song Breaking Up. Breaking up is hard to do. So is paradigm change. You have a paradigm that not only seems to make sense scientifically, but seems to make sense to the public. We've considered obesity a problem of overeating for millennia. Back in Hippocrates' days, obesity was considered a weakness of character. We see the manifestation of the problem. People with obesity eat a lot more, and they can't control their eating from one perspective. But if that's being driven by biology, not by lack of discipline or willpower, the implications are much different. So take somebody with edema. Edema, a person could be gallons of excess fluid in their body. It's in their legs or abdomen or in their lungs. And they tend to be thirsty and they overdrink. They're drinking more despite the fact that they have too much fluid in their body. Why are they thirsty? Because the fluid isn't where it needs to be in the bloodstream. And in fact, the bloodstream is getting too concentrated. And so the thirst is a proper reaction to an improper situation. Simplistically, we could blame the person with edema for overdrinking, but we don't, because we understand there's a biological problem. And I think if we have a better understanding of the biological drivers of obesity, not only will we get more effective treatment that's not focused on symptoms but cause, but we'll also destigmatize the problem, because we will understand that this is not a question of self-control.
Any questions from the audience? Thank you.
Thanks, David. That was terrific. And as an observer from a different world in this debate, it's fascinating to hear that position directly. Thank you. In listening to the presentation of Surmount 4 just a week ago, there was a discussion which was similar to this. And I hark back to the sentiment you made about the processed food. Good but imprecise. And would you believe Mike Lean stood up in the room and said, well, come on, as we're watching these interventions exert their effect, should we not be thinking about the synergy between the appropriate management of diet alongside the GLP-1, GIP, dual agonists? And you were sort of talking about that, and you said, let's do the study. So when is the study going to happen? When are we going to see your more precise, and not just good, your more precise approaches to the management of your hypothesis in the real world sit alongside those new interventions?
Yeah, well, thank you. So I'm going to make a fundamental political error and embarrass my sponsor, because I saw these wonderful slides of Swiss Re and their many, many billions of dollars, which is fortunately linked to our health. They're betting that we're going to live healthy, long lives. That's when they make money. So let's take 0.01% of those annual billions and put it into a definitive study that will do this. I apologize.
Where's Paul? Is Paul in the room? Ani.
Thank you, David. Excellent talk. And of course, I need to thank you for quoting some of my studies. But I just have a comment.
See, I just point out that he's been doing it longer than I have, and things still haven't changed.
Okay. David, now we will have a panel discussion about precision medicine and personalized nutrition. And I just think that you also have some comments on how these differences in insulin secretion capacity and insulin resistance actually translate into, you could say, susceptibility to carbohydrates and glycemic loads, which also in some way could be utilized to tailor-make a diet that are more effective for some of those, depending on their insulin secretion. Can you just expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, thank you, Arne. I didn't have time to go through the issues of personalized or precision medicine, and you'll be talking about the differences between those. But the model itself predicts that not everybody is going to be equally susceptible to weight gain and adverse metabolic effects on a high-carb diet. And that a key factor is, not surprisingly, insulin secretion. There are genetic determinants of insulin secretion, and there are probably acquired changes. So beginning with that animal study that I showed you in Lancet 2004, continuing through epi studies and clinical trials, we see a very consistent signal. The high insulin secretors gain weight or they suppress their energy expenditure substantially more than the low insulin secretors. So if you're a low insulin secretor, you probably have more flexibility. And maybe for those people, fat restriction could be advantageous in some ways. But for the high insulin secretors, the process of shifting metabolic fuels is dominant, and we need to start with that. And I think that perspective should be built into future clinical trials so we can power them to make this distinction.
Great. We have 1 minute, Gary. So
Thank you.
10-second question.
Watching your talk made me think of a way to phrase an issue we've batted back and forth now for 20 years, well, 10 years. One way to lower glycemic index is to feed sugar with its half fructose content rather than white flour, for instance. So if we did the Sprague-Dawley rat experiment and compared an animal with a high glycemic index diet from starch to an animal with a lower glycemic index with a significant amount of calories replaced by sugar and the fructose, which doesn't really stimulate raised blood sugar, and ran that experiment out for 6 months. So isocaloric, high glycemic index versus lower glycemic index, high starch versus high sugar. Do you think you would see a difference in weight, and which way would it go?
Yeah, let me. So I can't answer that question confidently, but let me say that I didn't have time to build in fructose into the model. It's clearly there. There's no question that fast digesting fructose in large amounts has major adverse metabolic effects. The way I think about that is fructose takes the hit on the liver, the glucose takes the hit on the beta cells, pick your poison. But I'm also impressed, and another call out to BMJ, which just published an epidemiological study based on several cohorts. We see a big signal from glucose equivalents. We don't see the same big signal from fructose equivalents. And we eat a lot more glucose equivalents than we do fructose equivalents. So I think there are going to be interesting differences. I'm not of a mind like Johnson or Lustig that fructose is the dominant poison, and I think that study needs to be done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, David.